The town of Brookhaven wasn't the kind of place where people locked their doors at night. It was the sort of place where neighbors still brought each other pies and everyone knew the sheriff by his first name. The population had barely grown in the past 20 years, and even the teenagers joked that time moved slower here. But everything changed on the morning of September 14th, when a man named Thomas Avery was found dead in his living room with no signs of forced entry, no obvious wounds, and no clear cause of death. Detective Caleb Rourke had been working homicides in the city for 15 years before moving to the quieter, simpler Brookhaven precinct. He'd transferred there last spring, hoping to find some peace after his wife passed away. Brookhaven was supposed to be a place where he could breathe again, maybe even start over. But death, it seemed, had followed him. He stood on the front porch of Thomas Avery's modest ranch-style home, looking out over the quiet street. Kids were playing basketball in a driveway 2 houses down. A golden retriever barked from behind a white picket fence. It all felt wrong. Inside, Thomas Avery was slumped on his couch, television still on, a cup of coffee sitting untouched on the side table. No signs of struggle. No blood. No fingerprints other than his own. Caleb stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. Everything was in order. Remote on the armrest, slippers on the floor, books stacked neatly by the fireplace. It was too clean. People didn't die in their living rooms without leaving some kind of mark behind. The coroner, Dr. Lisa Monroe, arrived shortly after. She was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed and no-nonsense, the kind of professional who didn't sugarcoat anything. After a quick inspection, she looked up at Caleb. "There's nothing visible," she said. "No bruises, no abrasions. We'll need the toxicology report, but this doesn't look natural." "Poison?" Caleb asked. "Possibly. Or something neurological." But he wasn't sick, at least not according to the neighbor who called it in. "Who found him?" "Eleanor Reeves. Lives next door. Said she comes by every morning to bring him a newspaper." Caleb made a note. He'd talk to her next. Eleanor was in her 70s, with neatly styled silver hair and hands that trembled slightly as she held a cup of tea. She sat at her kitchen table, glancing nervously at the window facing Thomas's house. "He was always up by 7, she said. He'd wave to me while watering his plants. But this morning the lights were still off. I knocked but no answer. The door was open, which was strange. He never left his door unlocked." "Did he have any health issues?" Caleb asked. "Not that I know of. He walked every evening. Clean. Even gave up coffee last year, though I guess he started again. Said it helped him sleep, which I thought was odd." "Help him sleep?" Eleanor nodded. "I know it sounds strange. I asked him about it last week. He said he was having bad dreams. Woke up drenched in sweat. Said he felt watched." Caleb paused. "Did he say by who?" "No. He didn't want to talk about it. Just said it reminded him of things he'd rather forget." "What kind of things?" Eleanor's hands trembled a bit more. "Thomas. He used to work in intelligence. NSA, I think. Retired early. Never talked about what he did. But sometimes when something was on the news, he'd get this look. Like he'd seen too much. That changed everything. If Thomas Avery had worked for the NSA, it was possible he had made enemies. Long forgotten ones. Back at the precinct, Caleb began digging. Officially, Avery's records ended with his retirement from a vague-sounding government department. But an old contact of Caleb's from his city days owed him a favor and pulled a few strings. What he found was surprising. Avery had been involved in several Black Ops-level surveillance programs, none of which were supposed to exist. One in particular stood out, a project codenamed Silent Bloom. No public record of Silent Bloom existed. Just a single entry in a declassified report, stating that the program had been terminated with prejudice over a decade ago. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. He kept picturing Avery's peaceful-looking body, the untouched coffee, and the expressionless face. It was as if the man had simply stopped. No struggle, no fear, just an abrupt end. But the more Caleb thought about the phrase terminated with prejudice, the more uneasy he became. The next morning Lisa Monroe called. "I've got something," she said. Talk screen came back. "There's a compound I've never seen before in his blood. It doesn't even have a proper name, just a string of letters and numbers. But the way it interacts with the nervous system is surgical. Surgical. Like it was designed to shut down vital functions one by one. First motor control, then heart rate, then brain activity. Quiet. Clean. No mess. Military grade. Worse. This wasn't made for the battlefield. This was made to eliminate someone without leaving a trace." Caleb felt a cold weight settle in his chest. Could someone like him have had enemies? With his past? Absolutely. Caleb knew what he had to do. He needed to find out who else was connected to Silent Bloom. It was a long shot, but if this compound was related to that project, there might be others at risk. He called in another favor and got a name. Richard Heller. A former analyst who worked alongside Avery. Retired 5 years ago. Lived in Vermont. Caleb packed a bag and made the drive the same day. Heller lived alone in a cabin surrounded by pine trees. He answered the door with suspicion but let Caleb in after a brief explanation. The man looked older than his years, with yellowed fingers from cigarettes and a voice that cracked with every sentence. "You're here because of Thomas, aren't you?" Caleb nodded. "You heard." Heller took a long drag from his cigarette. "I knew before the news. Felt it. We used to joke that if Silent Bloom ever came back, we'd be the first to go. Why? Because we knew too much. We knew what it really was." "What was it?" Heller leaned forward, eyes intense. "It was never about surveillance. It was about control. Behavior manipulation. They were testing ways to influence decision-making through external triggers. Smells, sounds, even colors. Avery was one of the lead developers. I was the data guy. We realized too late that we weren't testing for national defense. We were perfecting something much worse." Caleb felt his pulse quicken. "Like what?" "Imagine convincing someone to betray their family, their country, without them knowing why. That's what Silent Bloom was. Got shut down officially. But you know how these things go. Someone always keeps the blueprints. Do you think someone's activating it again? I think someone's cleaning house. Would you be willing to testify?" Heller laughed bitterly. "To who? You think anyone would believe me? Half the project was classified by names I still can't pronounce." That night, Caleb stayed in a motel nearby. He didn't sleep. Around 3 a.m. he received a call. It was Lisa Monroe. Her voice was shaking. "Caleb, there's been another death." "Who?" "Margaret Holmes. She came in for a routine appointment. Collapsed in the waiting room. Same symptoms. Same compound." The deadline had never worked for the government's ear. She had no ties to any intelligence program. He just sat there with the phone pressed to his head, quilting shop, staring at nothing. Caleb returned to wind outside his window howled through the Margaret's death changed like the theory. It knew something he didn't. Either the killer was Joanna Keller's last words, or this wasn't about Silent Bloom anymore. Then more will follow. At Margaret's shop, that's how this works. The nothing stood out until he checked the security camera from across the street. In the city had followed him into Brookhaven. A man walking out of her shop just it had no name, no face, no rules. He wore a black jacket, dark sunglasses, anyone connected to the Silent Bloom project was a potential facial recognition failed. He returned to the station the next morning using a technique that Caleb recognized from surveillance circles. No postage, no address. Whoever this was, just his name written in perfect block letters. He was trained. Inside was a black and white photograph. The timeline. For people sat at a table, Avery dies on the 14th, Thomas Margaret Avery, Holmes Margaret on the 16th, Holmes, Joanna Keller, 2 days apart, and someone no Caleb visible connection. But a man in his mid-30s, he found something. 10 years ago, even Thomas Avery and Margaret Holmes on the back of the photo attended a conference in Washington, D.C. He never forgot. A public tech summit. Caleb scanned the photo into the system, and Margaret had been invited for her innovations in community-based cognitive therapy. It didn't take long for a match. Specifically, Elias Marin, a technique she developed for patients with PTSD, presumed dead in a helicopter crash Silent 8 years ago, had tried to influence behavior. His body had been experimenting with restoring it. His file was sealed. What if they had shared more than a stage? The only thing publicly known was that Marin had suffered from a severe mental break 6 months before the mission. Caleb had to find out who else had been at that conference. If Elias Marin had faked his death or been written off, the list had over 200 names. He might believe that the people from those who had left government betrayed him or left him behind. Narrowed further to those who had filed patents or published papers related to cognitive manipulation. Caleb felt the weight of it all hit him at once. He started making calls. Whoever was orchestrating this wasn't just covering tracks. One was a woman named Joanna Keller. He was settling a score. Now living in Oregon. And the rules of the game had changed. She agreed to speak with him over the phone. He reached out to Joanna again. I remember Thomas, but the number had been disconnected. We had lunch at that conference. Back. He seemed when he heavy, called the local police like in her area. Carrying something. They confirmed her house had caught fire in the middle of the night. For a while. No survivors then found. One day, he stopped replying. Caleb didn't sleep. Did he ever mention silent bloom? He sat at his desk staring on the other end. Surveillance footage. I shouldn't be talking about this from the 2012 summit. You should then stop asking questions. There was one more name linked closely to both Avery and Keller. Already dead. A name buried in the attendance log, but never tied to any speech, publication, or department. That's how this works. Rachel Lennox. Caleb gripped the phone had been listed as an independent consultant, but the line no went company dead. Name. No further data. But her emergency contact was still in the system. Her younger brother, Evan Lennox, lived just 2 hours away, in a small lakeside town called Stillwater. Caleb got in his car and drove straight there. Stillwater was quieter than Brookhaven. Almost too quiet. The trees lining the streets were heavy with fog, and the houses seemed to lean in close, like they were whispering secrets to one another. Caleb found Evan Lennox working on an old car in his driveway. He looked up, wiping his hands on a rag. Detective Rourke. Caleb stopped mid-step. You know who I am. Evan nodded. Rachel told me if anyone came looking, it would be you. Where is she? Gone, Evan said simply. She left 3 days ago. Said she couldn't stay. Not after what happened to Thomas and Margaret. Do you know where she went? Evan hesitated. I'm not sure. She didn't tell me directly. But she left something for you. He walked into the garage and returned with a small metal lockbox. Inside were newspaper clippings, a USB drive, and an old key. Caleb plugged the drive into his laptop and found several folders labeled with project names, dates, and one titled Marin. He opened it. The files were heavily redacted, but there were enough pieces to form a picture. Elias Marin had been one of Silent Bloom's most promising assets. Not a developer but a test subject. The program had moved beyond manipulation into conditioning. They were trying to build a trigger, a phrase, a sound, a scent, that could activate specific behavior in someone conditioned to respond. Marin had been the first success. And the last. The documents indicated that after several tests, Marin became unstable. His sense of self began to fracture. He no longer distinguished between memory and reality. Then one day he disappeared. Everyone believed he had died in the crash overseas. But that crash might have been a cover. Or worse, intentional. Rachel believed he had survived. And that he had been triggered. A weapon that had been forgotten, now reactivated. Caleb leaned back, breath catching in his throat. This wasn't a series of murders. This was a man reliving a mission no one had ever meant to finish. And if Marin was following a sequence, a mental pattern built into his mind years ago, then there would be more targets. Places. Symbols. He flipped through the newspaper clippings. One article caught his eye. A piece about an abandoned facility outside town, once used for private research. There were rumors of government involvement, but nothing concrete. Rachel had circled the photo of the building and written one word beneath it. Final. Caleb didn't hesitate. He drove out to the facility just before sunset. The place was overgrown, windows shattered, but the structure still stood. As he entered, his footsteps echoed against concrete floors and rusted metal. The air smelled of mold and history. The facility had been gutted. But in the center room there was a chair. Not just any chair, but one bolted to the floor, surrounded by speakers, wires, and screens. It was the kind of place where a person could lose their mind. And someone had returned to it. On the far wall, written in charcoal, were the words, "I remember everything." That's when Caleb heard the door creak. He turned, drawing his weapon, but it was too late. A figure tackled him from behind, knocking the gun from his hand. The two of them rolled across the floor, grunting and fighting for control. Caleb managed to land a punch and scramble to his feet. Elias Marin stood across from him. He was older than in the photo, gaunt and hollow-eyed, but unmistakably him. "You shouldn't have come," Marin said, voice low and mechanical. "You don't have to keep doing this," Caleb said, trying to steady his breath. "They shut it down. Silent Bloom is over." "No," Marin replied. "It never ended. Just changed faces. They tried to bury me, make me forget. But I remember it all now. They used you, Elias. You were a test subject, not a soldier. They made me into what I am," Marin said. "And now I'm finishing the mission." Caleb saw the glint of metal in Marin's hand. A small syringe, the same kind used on Avery and Holmes. He backed up slowly. "I'm not part of this," he said. "You are now." Then, before Caleb could react, Marin lunged. But this time Caleb was ready. He ducked the first swing, grabbed a nearby pipe, and struck Marin across the shoulder. The syringe clattered to the floor. Marin roared in pain, grabbing Caleb by the collar and slamming him into the wall. "You don't get it," Marin screamed. "They'll keep doing it. If not me, then someone else." Caleb, gasping, whispered, "Maybe. But it won't be you." With a final surge, Caleb twisted free, grabbed his gun from the floor, and aimed it directly at Marin. "Don't," Marin growled. "You don't want to carry that weight." "I already do." The gunshot rang out and echoed through the empty corridors. Elias Marin collapsed. It was over. Margaret Holmes had never worked for the government. She had no ties to any intelligence program. She owned a quilting shop. Caleb returned to Brookhaven immediately. Margaret's death changed the theory. Either the killer was getting sloppy, or this wasn't about Silent Bloom anymore. At Margaret's shop, he looked for clues. Nothing stood out until he checked the security camera from across the street. The footage showed a man walking out of her shop just minutes before she collapsed. He wore a black jacket, dark sunglasses, and moved with military precision. Facial recognition failed. His image had been blurred using a technique that Caleb recognized from surveillance circles. Whoever this was, he wasn't just dangerous, he was trained. At the precinct, Caleb mapped out the timeline. Thomas Avery dies on the 14th, Margaret Holmes on the 16th. 2 days apart. No visible connection. But when he looked deeper, he found something. 10 years ago, Thomas Avery and Margaret Holmes had both attended a conference in Washington, D.C., a public tech summit. Avery was a speaker. Margaret had been invited for her innovations in community-based cognitive therapy. Specifically, a technique she developed for patients with PTSD. Click. Silent Bloom had tried to influence behavior. Margaret had been experimenting with restoring it. What if they had shared more than a stage? What if they'd talked? If someone was tying up loose ends, Caleb had to find out who else had been at that conference, and who might be next. The list had over 200 names. Caleb filtered it down to those who had left government work, narrowed further to those who had filed patents or published papers related to cognitive manipulation. That left 5 names. He started making calls. Only 3 answered. One was a woman named Joanna Keller, now living in Oregon. She agreed to speak with him over the phone. "I remember Thomas," she said. "We had lunch at that conference. He seemed heavy, like he was carrying something. Did you stay in touch?" "For a while. Emails. Then one day he stopped replying." "Did he ever mention Silent Bloom?" There was silence on the other end. "I shouldn't be talking about this," Joanna said. "You should stop asking questions." "I can't. 2 people are already dead." Then, barely above a whisper, "Then more will follow. That's how this works." Caleb gripped the phone tighter. "Who's behind this?" But the line went dead. In the weeks that followed, Caleb filed reports that would never be read by the people who needed to see them. Rachel Lennox returned and entered witness protection. The facility was sealed off, officially listed as a hazard zone due to asbestos. Silent Bloom vanished from all government servers, as if it never existed. But Caleb knew better. He sat on his porch one evening, sipping coffee, staring at the trees swaying in the wind. His phone buzzed. It was an unlisted number. He hesitated, then answered. A voice, calm and composed, said, "You did well, detective. But some things are better left buried." The line went dead. And for the first time in weeks, Caleb felt fear. Not for what he had done, but for what was still out there waiting to wake up.